50 years on, Aberfan stops to remember the disaster which killed 116 children and 28 adults. Today's school children fell silent to remember an earlier generation almost entirely lost. The village has marked the precise moment when a mountain of coal waste slid down the hillside, engulfing a school and houses. This lunchtime, the Prince of Wales is visiting the community to pay his respects. Also in today's programme, a Russian aircraft carrier sails through the Straits of Dover on its way to Syria. Defence officials say it'll be watched every step of the way. Fighters from so-called Islamic State launch a wave of coordinated attacks in the Iraqi city of Kirkuk. 15 months in prison for the fake sheikh. The journalist Mazza Mahmood is jailed for tampering with evidence. And the gala dinner that turned sour. The knives come out again between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Here in the South, the Conservatives hold on to their Witney seat, but their majority is slashed. And 7 million paper coffee cups thrown away each day. Now the inventor from West Sussex serving up a new solution.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. At 9:15 this morning, 50 years to the moment, silence fell over Aberfan as the village remembered the disaster that claimed the lives of 116 children and 28 adults. They died when a mountain of coal mining waste collapsed and engulfed the primary school and houses. Survivors and relatives of those who died were at the ceremony this morning, and more events will be held throughout the day. Our correspondent, Bethan Rees-Roberts, is in Aberfan. Bethan.
Yes, we're just outside the Garden of Remembrance here in Aberfan, Jane, where just a few minutes ago the Prince of Wales arrived to pay his respects. He is now being taken around the garden, meeting local people, dignitaries, politicians. The Secretary of State for Wales is here, the First Minister of Wales is here. He will then plant a tree in this garden and will be told about the poignant layout of this garden, which is designed to reflect the classrooms of that school which was engulfed in slurry on that tragic day 50 years ago. A day when school children gathered on this very site for the last day of school before the half-term holidays. But it was a day that was to scar this community forever. Thomas Morgan reports.
50 years to the day at 9:15 a.m, a Welsh community was torn apart. And at 9:15 this morning, a community and a nation remembers one of the worst disasters in Welsh and British modern times. In 1966, the coal industry was still booming in South Wales. The local colliery had been dumping waste onto Mynydd Merthyr above the village of Aberfan for some time. But days of heavy rain in mid-October turned that waste into slurry. And on the morning of the 21st, a subsidence caused that slurry to come crashing down like an avalanche into the village.
When the coal tip at Aberfan near Merthyr Tydfil slid forward, engulfing an infant school and a row of houses.
Bearing the brunt of the damage was Pantglas Junior School. Sitting next to the window as a child when disaster struck was David Davis.
My body was brought out and initially placed with those that had died and been covered in a blanket until someone said that they thought they saw my foot move. So I was re-examined and evidently a sign of life still there.
116 children died, along with 28 adults. Had the slurry hit hours later, the school would have been empty. It was the last day of term. Hundreds came to join the rescue efforts, many from collieries across South Wales. One of the first on the scene was policewoman Yvonne Price, who suffered with PTSD due to the tragedy.
When we were passing the dead children through, one man just looked down and just turned and looked at me and he said, "That was my child." Oh. It was one of the worst things, and he just carried on working.
In the immediate aftermath, locals demanded to know why this had happened. They had raised repeated concerns about the tipping. Was it a terrible accident or a preventable man-made catastrophe? A tribunal was set up to inquire why and how this disaster had happened. Lasting 76 days, it was the longest of its kind at the time, with over 100 people interviewed and 300 exhibits examined. Its findings were that this tragedy was in fact avoidable, with the blame resting entirely on the National Coal Board. To this day, that event has had a resounding impact on this community.
The tragedy has shaped the community indelibly and shaped the lives of everybody affected by it, everybody closely affected by it, the children and their parents, and even people a good deal further away from it.
Gas struck above ground.
Destruction and devastation which should have been avoided. But 50 years on, this current generation remembers the generation that was lost. And a community that was shattered will never forget. Thomas Morgan, BBC News, Aberfan.
And the Prince is continuing his visit of the Garden of Remembrance right here next to us, meeting those dignitaries before he moves on down the road into the community centre, where he will meet some of the survivors of that day and also unveil a plaque in memory of those events. Now, this is a community which is not only dealing with that tragedy half a century ago, but then went on to fight for justice. A community which came together, and a community which will never, ever forget those events of 50 years ago. Jane.
Bethan, thank you. Bethan Rees-Roberts there in Aberfan. A Russian aircraft carrier and its support ships are passing through the English Channel, reportedly to join other forces in the war in Syria. The flotilla was monitored by Royal Navy warships as it passed through the Straits of Dover early this morning. The Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, says the ships will be watched every step of the way as they pass the UK. Here's our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg.
Russian warships this morning in the Strait of Dover. The task force is heading to the Mediterranean and the conflict in Syria. But this is the biggest demonstration of Moscow's military might off Britain's coast for years. Sailing through the English Channel today is Russia's only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. And close by, the nuclear-powered battlecruiser, Peter the Great. And shadowing the Russians, the Royal Navy. The British government has promised that the Russian fleet will be marked every inch of the way. It suspects that the Russians are trying to test British capabilities by sailing close to UK shores.
Well, the deployment itself is clearly directed in the immediate sense towards Syria, but it has a side benefit to the mentality of the present-day leaders of Russia, of showing that they still have a navy of some significance, and that message to this country in particular is probably that their navy is more extensive than ours now.
One of the ships in the flotilla is the anti-submarine destroyer, the Vice Admiral Kulakov. Earlier this year, the Russians granted us rare access to the ship on a previous deployment to the Mediterranean. They showed us its 100mm naval cannon for destroying targets in the air and at sea. And they opened up the hatches to show off their biggest rockets. Some of the Russian media have described this as a Russian armada. But this deployment is about more than just Moscow boosting its firepower in Syria. It sends a strong message to the West, to Europe and the United States, that Russia is a global player and a military force to be reckoned with. It's also a country facing international condemnation over recent Russian airstrikes on Aleppo. Moscow claims that the Russian and Syrian air forces have been targeting only terrorists here. It's announced a pause in the air campaign, it says, to allow civilians out of the city. If Russia resumes airstrikes on Aleppo, its aircraft carrier could play a key role in the operation. But for these warships, the route is almost as important as the destination. Moscow wants the world to see that Syria is a red line for Moscow, and it won't be backing down. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
While the eyes of the world are on the assault against Mosul, held by so-called Islamic State, IS fighters have launched an attack on Kirkuk, 100 miles to the southeast. There are reports of fighting around government buildings. Kurdish forces took control of the city in 2014, and it's become a home to refugees fleeing conflict in other parts of the country. Our correspondent Richard Galpin is near Mosul and sent us this report.
A series of explosions shaking the city of Kirkuk this morning. An audacious attack by ISIS militants, including suicide bombers, determined to prove they remain a potent force in northern Iraq. They seem to have had a clear goal to get inside important buildings, and some succeeded. The assault caught the security forces by surprise, but in a series of fierce firefights, they claim to have killed many of the militants. And while all this was going on in Kirkuk, another group of militants was attacking villages to the west and a power station to the north, leaving Iraqi and Iranian workers dead. The Kirkuk attack is clearly aimed at diverting the Iraqi army from its ongoing offensive on the key ISIS stronghold of Mosul, which has been directed by this command center here to the south of the city. But today, that offensive has continued as normal, including with a big barrage of missiles being fired from here, which we witnessed earlier this morning. It's particularly here on the Eastern Front that significant progress has been made in recent days in pushing towards the city of Mosul. But for these Kurdish fighters, known as the Peshmerga, the fighting's getting tougher as they advance. They're taking more and more casualties, particularly here in this battle for the town of Bashika. ISIS militants are dug in and well prepared to defend it, slowing down the Peshmerga's advance to the main objective, Mosul, the militants' last big stronghold in Iraq. Richard Galpin, BBC News, in northern Iraq.
Here, official figures show that government borrowing rose last month compared to the same period last year. It went up slightly to £10.6 billion, meaning the government is unlikely to meet its own target of reducing the deficit. Our economics correspondent, Andy Verity, is with me. Not what the government is trying to achieve, Andy?
No, it's going in the wrong direction, basically, Jane. It's supposed to be going down, and for it to go up compared to last year, even in 1 month, is not good for the deficit reduction strategy. As you know, for the last 6 years, it's been the central goal of the government to reduce the gap between its income and its spending. It outspends its income at the moment in September by £10.6 billion. And if you look at the year to date, it's down, but not by much. So for the whole year, we're supposed to borrow no more than £55 billion in the public sector for the whole year. But if you look at the 6 months to date, from April to September, we've already borrowed £45.5 billion. So there's not much headroom. There's only about 10 billion left. The overwhelming likelihood is that we're going to bust that limit and not hit that target. And you can expect Philip Hammond, the new Chancellor, at the autumn statement to say, well, that's not our goal anymore. But the question is, if you have to constantly shift the goalposts and give a bit of extra time in order for us not to miss the goal, what sort of a goal is it? What does it mean anymore? And should we really be aiming for it?
Andy, thank you. Andy Verity. The Conservatives have held the seat of Witney in Oxfordshire in the by-election caused by the resignation of David Cameron. But the party was given a run for its money by the Liberal Democrats, who cut the Tories' majority from more than 25,000 to 5,700. From Witney, our political correspondent Tom Bateman sent this report.
Victory in a safe Conservative seat. Robert Courts takes the place vacated by David Cameron on the Tory benches. But the party's majority has been slashed from a thumping 60% of the vote last year to 45% last night.
Today, Robert's got that in a by-election with 14 candidates. So I think he's put on a really strong campaign, been a great local candidate and will be a great voice for the people of Witney.
Mr Cameron's life as an MP began here. The young backbencher couldn't have known then the hand he would have in transforming British politics, with a vote to leave the EU, his resignation, and then the handover to a new Prime Minister. In Witney, the Liberal Democrats poured resources into their campaign. They came second and knocked Labour into third place. Nearly a third of voters backed the party that suffered a shattering general election performance only last year.
Well, the people of Witney got more than just the kitchen sink thrown at them by the Liberal Democrats in this by-election. They got the entire building. And the party that came second here has a simple message. It says the Liberal Democrats are back. And they claim this result is a verdict on the government's approach to Brexit.
It felt very much on the doorsteps that people, including people who'd voted Leave, were voting Liberal Democrat this time round because they didn't vote to leave the single market. They didn't vote for our shop prices to go up, petrol prices to go up, and for British jobs to be lost to overseas.
The result also raises big challenges for Labour. Their leader Jeremy Corbyn put his party on a general election footing last month. According to last night's figures, they wouldn't be on the path to victory.
Well, our share of the vote was more or less the same. I don't think people were expecting Labour to win that. The Liberals threw an enormous amount of resources at it. They even made 100 of their lords in the House of Lords go to it, the poor things.
Senior Conservatives brush off the idea that this vote was about Britain and the EU. The Liberal Democrats will argue it was. Either way, there's little doubt that the debate about Brexit will continue to dominate our politics for some time to come. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Witney.
Meanwhile, Labour won the by-election in Batley and Spen, where Jo Cox was the MP before she was killed in June. The former Coronation Street actress Tracy Brabin retained the seat for Labour, winning 85% of the vote.
It was a phenomenal campaign run in difficult circumstances where people are absolutely heartbroken about what happened, and what we saw as a tragedy, others saw as an opportunity to get out there disunity and hatred, and I think tonight has been a huge success for us and the Labour movement.
Tracy Brabin. Theresa May has held talks with her EU counterparts this morning at her first meeting of the EU Council. Last night, the Prime Minister said Britain intends to remain at the heart of the EU right up until the moment of its departure. Let's talk to our Europe correspondent, Damian Grammaticus. What's your sense, Damian, of the reception that the Prime Minister's getting there where you are?
Well, Jane, if you listen to Jean-Claude Juncker, as he arrived this morning, he was asked for his first impressions of Theresa May in the light that she had said he might find her a difficult person to deal with. He said he found her charming. And those two are about to sit down now to a lunch at which they will start to talk about Theresa May's sort of vision for how she sees the next few months unfolding. But I think the reality is that the rest of the EU, as they made clear last night, are not going to engage until the UK and Theresa May are absolutely clear, one, about what they want, and two, about triggering the process. So last night Theresa May had 5 minutes at 1 o'clock in the morning simply to address the other leaders. Today they've moved on to other subjects, and the EU's trade deal with Canada, which is bogged down because of objections from a regional parliament here in Belgium, in Wallonia. That's a bigger issue at the minute and more pressing issue for the EU. Also the issue of Russia and what to do about what's happening in Aleppo. But Brexit will start to dominate as soon as Theresa May starts to trigger the process.
All right, Damian, thank you. Damian Grammaticus there in Brussels. The time is 18 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. Commemorations have been held in Aberfan to remember the moment 50 years ago when 116 children and 28 adults died. Also on the programme, the knives are out between Trump and Clinton at what was supposed to be a genteel gala dinner.
And on South Today, the Tories keep hold of their seat in the Witney by-election, but their majority is slashed as the Lib Dems make gains. And where have they all gone? The fierce seahorses are becoming locally extinct off the Dorset coast.
The annual Alfred E. Smith Memorial Foundation dinner in New York is a white tie gala during which tradition dictates the two presidential candidates poke gentle fun at one another. But this is the campaign between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. At last night's dinner, that rule was broken. If anything, the event picked up where the last rancorous televised debate left off, as Smita Mundasad now reports.
Oh, say does that star-spangled...
This should have been a moment for a change of tune. Traditionally, this dinner is a chance for a pause in political hostilities. But with these candidates, was that ever really going to happen? At first, Donald Trump holds back against his rival.
Michelle Obama
gives a speech, and everyone loves it. It's fantastic. They think she's absolutely great. My wife, Melania, gives the exact same speech. And people get on her case.
Hillary Clinton started with some gentle jabs at herself.
This is such a special event that I took a break from my rigorous nap schedule to be here. And as you've already heard, it's a treat for all of you too, because usually I charge a lot for speeches.
But even the Archbishop of New York sat between them, couldn't keep the peace.
Hillary is so corrupt. She got kicked off the Watergate Commission. How corrupt do you have to be to get kicked off the Watergate Commission?
Donald wanted me drug tested before last night's debate. And look, I got to tell you, I am so flattered that Donald thought I used some sort of performance enhancer. Now, actually, I did. It's called preparation.
At the end, it took a nudge from the Archbishop for the rivals to even shake hands. And with Election Day nearly in sight, it's clear this war of words is not over. Smitha Mundasad, BBC News.
The newspaper journalist Mazza Mahmood, who's known as the fake sheikh, has been jailed for 15 months for tampering with evidence during the trial of the pop star Tulisa Kontostavlos. Let's talk to our correspondent Sarah Campbell. Tell us more about what happened in sentencing, Sarah.
Well, the gallery was packed, Jane, in court number 11 with many of those who'd had dealings with the fake sheikh. And as he was led down to the cells, there were cries of "in joy," because Mazza Mahmood, over the last 20 or so years, had hugely embarrassed public figures and, according to his own claims, had put around 100 people behind bars. So this case involved the singer Tulisa, who'd been caught up in a drug sting. Her case had collapsed, and Mahmood was found guilty of encouraging a key witness to change his evidence. And today, sentencing him, the judge said that Mahmood's motive was to preserve and enhance your reputation. You wanted another scalp, and to achieve it, you were prepared for the court to be deceived. But this case is about much more than Tulisa, because what it does is cast doubt on the tactics and evidence of this reporter. So take John Alford, the former Grange Hill and London's Burning star. He was here today. He was caught up in a drug sting back in the 1990s at the height of his fame, and he said that that ruined his life. He was sent to jail, and he says now that no one should be above the law. And he's one of at least 8 people we know who are looking to have their criminal convictions overturned. Now, Mahmood's employer, News UK, said today that his employment had been terminated, but they added after 25 years, which has led to the exposure of criminality and wrongdoing. Mahmood's barrister said in court today that his client was a frightened man and that he was not expecting to be a popular inmate, given all the people he'd been responsible for convicting. Jane.
Thank you, Sarah Campbell. A former police officer has been found guilty of sexually abusing young boys. Police Sergeant Alan Richards, who's 54, carried out his attacks for more than 30 years. West Midlands Police investigated him twice more than a decade ago, but he wasn't charged. Our correspondent Phil Mackey reports from Birmingham Crown Court.
The man who abused vulnerable boys for decades. He should have been someone they could trust, a scout leader and police sergeant. His first victim was just 8 years old when he was sexually assaulted in the 1970s, but he was only contacted by police 40 years later.
As soon as the police said they wanted to talk to me about an incident or a possible incident when I was in the Cubs, it was like opening up Pandora's box. Everything came flooding back.
Alan Richards was a policeman in central Birmingham for many years. He worked as a custody officer here. He even lured one of his victims to this station.
West Midlands Police could have stopped Richards twice, in 2000 and again 4 years later, but he wasn't charged. The Scouts sacked him, the police moved him to a desk job. He kept diaries which detailed his victims and the abuse he'd committed, but detectives only found them after he retired, when there was a third investigation.
I think a lot has changed in UK policing over the last 10, 15 years.
where we take a very wide view in relation to investigations rather than just dealing with what's immediately in front of us.
Despite overwhelming evidence, Richards pleaded not guilty, forcing his victims to come to court and relive their abuse.
He knows he's guilty just like we all know he's guilty. So he still has no concern or care about any of the people that he's hurt over the years. So I don't think he should be allowed the opportunity to hurt anybody else.
Richards is already in custody and can expect to be given a lengthy jail term when he's sentenced next month. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Birmingham.
The Court of Session in Edinburgh has ruled in favour of the Scottish Government's plans to introduce a minimum price for a unit of alcohol. It rejected a challenge by the whisky industry, which argued the measure discriminated against poorer drinkers. Universities and student unions need to do more to tackle violence against women, harassment and hate crime on their campuses. That's one of the recommendations made in a report by Universities UK, which also says there needs to be more support for victims and better recording of allegations. Helena Lee reports.
Alice Irving was in her second year at university when she was raped. She says she didn't get the right support at the time, which made an already difficult experience even harder.
I didn't want it to affect me. I was kind of staunchly hoping that it wouldn't change me because I didn't want to give him that power, but it has. Just your sense of bodily integrity and your sense of control over your own sex life, and all of that is profoundly affected, and reclaiming that is a process, and I still haven't figured it out.
Today's report by Universities UK looks at what more universities need to do to help those like Alice and others who face harassment and hate crime. It says there needs to be better recording of allegations. Victims, too, should be given more support. And
we are also recommending that staff be trained so that they can provide the appropriate support and advice to the student, can refer them on to the specialist services that they need. And that training might include a member of staff knowing that they're not the right person to try and give that advice.
The government has welcomed the report, saying any form of harassment or abuse is unacceptable. It's asked Universities UK to get back to them in 6 months to tell them what progress has been made. Helena Lee, BBC News.
Now, for years, Steve Etches earned a living as a plumber, but in his spare time he would wander the Dorset coastline, the Jurassic Coast, collecting fossils. He's now a world-renowned expert in the field, and today a £5 million museum housing his collection is opening in his hometown of Kimmeridge. Duncan Kennedy reports from Dorset.
From ceramic to Jurassic, Steve Etches is the plumber who became a paleontologist.
So this is where it all began for you?
Yep, this is it. These are the rocks that I've spent my last 35 years looking at.
It all began on this beach in Dorset.
You can't stop finding fossils.
No, you can't. Anyone who come along the beach, you'll see fossils all over the place here.
Steve was an apprentice plumber at 16, but was always fascinated by fossils. So he started collecting and collecting and collecting.
And here we are in the garage.
Yep.
He amassed 2,500 specimens, so many he turned his garage into a display.
For the last 22 years it's been in here, but also it's migrated into the dining room as well.
But it wasn't enough, so 4 years ago he set out to establish this, the Steve Etches Museum. It's a unique, world-class collection from the 150-million-year-old Jurassic coastline.
Not many people can say, I've got a museum named after me.
Yeah, but I never asked for that. That was done at a vote when I went to the loo, and I came back and they said, oh, by the way, we're going to call it the Etches Collection. I thought, thanks very much.
And a long way from an apprentice plumber all the way to being in charge and running your own fossil museum.
Plumbing was a job that had to be done to earn money, but now this is the dream come true, really.
It took £5 million of private and heritage lottery money to create.
What do you make of the story, the backstory of Steve the plumber becoming Steve the paleontologist?
That's a remarkable story, because what it does is to say that everyone can pursue a dream, and pursue a dream in terms even in a scientific way.
Steve may now have swapped air valves for ammonites, But his old habits are not yet extinct. He even helped fix the loo in his new museum. Now a place for science, education and wonderment.
Fantastic story, wonderful. Duncan Kennedy there in Dorset. And staying with things Jurassic, researchers in Australia have announced the discovery of a new species of dinosaur. Remains of the creature, which was as tall as a modern giraffe and nearly 50 feet long, were found in rocks in Queensland 11 years ago. Almost a quarter of the skeleton has now been retrieved. Now it's time to catch up with the weather prospects. Let's get all the latest details from Helen Willett. Hello.
Hello, Jane. What a good afternoon for fossil hunting if you are heading down to the Jurassic coastline. We did have a little bit of mist though this morning. We've had some fantastic weather watcher pictures in today. Once the mist and the fog lifted though, lovely sunshine coming through. Not sunshine for all, I have to stress, actually the east coast. And as you can see at St Andrews, it is quite cloudy. The east coast has been plagued by a lot more cloud, but it's still largely dry for the majority of us. The lion's share of the sunshine in the southwest and Wales, it's glorious here, but there's still a little rain to come, still in southeast Scotland and the northeast of England, and a few showers actually across East Anglia. But for Northern Ireland, for much of Scotland, it's a really nice day away from the south and the east. It's glorious up in Shetland as well. A little bit of rain for the northeast of England, but elsewhere, fewer showers than yesterday, a little bit of sunshine coming through. So even though you saw a lot of cloud, it is still bright. But obviously it's sunny in Wales and the southwest, which is where we had most of the fog this morning. And despite a few sharp showers, even perhaps you may hear a rumble of thunder in East Anglia, there's still some dry and bright weather in between. And eventually this evening we lose that keen northerly wind and we pick up an easterly instead. And for most of us, the night time is actually with light winds, and we see some cloud drifting its way westwards, which means that even eastern areas with some breaks in the cloud tonight could get quite chilly. Last night, towns and cities were certainly down to single figures, but in the countryside we had some frost around, so a little bit of iciness first thing tomorrow morning and potentially some mist and fog like this morning, not lifting till about the middle of the morning. It is after all October. So we've got a few showers to come tomorrow, but fewer than today, and hopefully it'll be brighter as well than today across eastern parts of England and eastern Scotland, with some patchy cloud elsewhere. Perhaps the odd shower for Northern Ireland, more so than today. Another lovely afternoon for the Northern Isles. And for most of us, temperatures will again reach what they should do at this time of year, which is 11 to 15. But with the light winds, I think a lovely day for getting out and about, considering, of course, it's half term for some. What about Sunday? Well, very little changes. The high pressure is still with us, keeping things fine and dry, but this low pressure is lurking out to the southwest. So the tightening isobars mean that we'll get some windier weather. So it's really not a day for heading out in a small boat or raft in the southwest in particular. Gale force winds potentially here. Otherwise, elsewhere, once the morning mist and frost lifts, another nice day, just a few eastern showers really. This rain looming is really very late in the day, as you can see. More of an evening or after dark feature for the southwest. Yes, it could be heavy, and it's worth mentioning because there'll be a lot travelling this weekend, but actually the weekend for most of us holds a lot of dry and bright weather after the early morning fog and frost. Jane.
Good, thanks very much, lovely. Thanks very much, Helen. And that is all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we join the BBC's news teams wherever you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.